Hello, everybody. Here we are at another episode of Perspective with a guest that I am so excited to have, Durant Ashmore. The revolution in South Carolina, we believe, and many scholars from across the nation believe that the battles and conflicts that ended up putting the British into a spot of surrender in Yorktown, on the shores of the York River in Virginia, all started because of what happened in the upcountry of South Carolina and North Carolina. This is a very exciting episode for me. The revolution is something I have always absolutely loved the subject of, with my family being involved on both sides of the conflict. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I hope there's something you can learn. I know I did. So, with no further ado, let's get into the conversation with Durant Ashmore on Perspective. All right, Durant, welcome to Prosperity.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. It's a charming city.
Yeah, it's been home for our family for a very long time. So Durant, let's start at the beginning and just introduce yourself because the theme of everything we do is place, purpose, preservation. So what is the place that put you on a trajectory to put you what you're doing now?
Well, I would say that it's my history.
Yeah.
And we're talking about history. I'm a seventh generation South Carolinian. My family was the first settlers in Greenville County. I'm a fifth generation Greenville Countyan. Went to Greenville High School, graduated from Furman University.
What did you graduate in?
Psychology, so you better be careful. Yeah.
I watched.
But learning about my family is one thing that got me so interested in this history, and particularly with Revolutionary War history.
Yeah.
I am descended from one of Francis Marion's men, Henry Durant, and, he had some interesting exploits. He was actually a spy for Francis Marion.
Oh, wow.
However, spy meant a totally different thing in the 18th century than it did now. He was a scout.
Yeah.
But that was pretty neat. But I found out that I'm also descended from a Loyalist colonel. And that Loyalist colonel lived right here in the Dutch Fork, Colonel William Ballantyne.
Yeah, the Ballantines, yeah.
Right, Ballantyne, South Carolina was named after him.
Right.
So, or his father, one or the other. So,
but you're also in horticulture, though, right? What is your because professional? You're a professional landscaper,
right?
Tell me about that.
Well, I'm a landscape designer and nurseryman. I grow my own plants that I use in my landscaping, and it was something I had the opportunity to do when I was in my mid-20s, and I went for it, and I loved it, and I totally enjoyed, working outside, working with plants, working with nature. And while I just was self-taught, but while I was doing this at the age of 27 and 30 and so forth, I was thinking to myself, I like the way this is going, but what does the book say about what we're doing here?
Mm-hmm.
So I did go back to school and got a master's degree in landscape architecture at the University of Georgia. And my thesis was on Cherokee uses of medicinal plants.
Ooh.
I have a graduate minor in historic preservation, and I know native plants. I also know the type of plants that would have been on battlefields in the Revolutionary War in the backcountry of South Carolina.
Wow.
And how those plants would have affected the battle. And in numerous cases it did, primarily river cane.
Oh, yeah, big time.
But there are so many battlefields in the backcountry of South Carolina. We have a rich history that I feel most people don't know about.
Well, they don't, and that's why I was excited to have you here, because I see this episode and see Perspective, this show, as an opportunity to communicate to folks not only in South Carolina but outside South Carolina the richness of what South Carolina is. And so many people look at South Carolina kind of one-dimensionally, especially outside the state. And you're such amazing focus on the Revolution. And as our local historian up here, I mean, you've done how many presentations on the Revolution? And
I've done dozens.
Yeah.
Dozens.
Yeah, and I've been on one of your field things when we went to 96, which was wonderful. But so I'd love for us to dive into the Revolution and kind of go into so we can talk about this narrative. But, you know, one thing I understand about wars, everybody talks about what was the trigger of the war, you know, what triggered it. But I tend to look at conflicts like this more like, well, the trigger had to be attached to something else. And usually wars are put into place because of circumstances 10, 20, 30, sometimes a century beforehand that builds the gun, the barrel, the stock, the powder, everything, to where when that trigger is finally fastened, that's what then pulls it. And nothing could be more true than on the Revolution.
That's true.
And I think there's a lot of ways we can go back even further, but I think the genesis of building that gun started with the French and Indian War.
I'll give it just a few years prior to that.
Okay.
Which is 1755, when the Treaty of Saluda was signed.
And that's here in South Carolina.
That's right. That's in Saluda, South Carolina.
So explain what that was to everybody.
Right. Well, that was a treaty whereby the British colonial government bought 10 westernmost counties here in South Carolina.
Now, they weren't counties in.
No,
it was
they
just
weren't,
a region.
And they were called districts, and it was called ceded territory.
Mm-hmm.
But the Cherokees sold Edgefield, McCormick, Abbeville, Greenwood, Lawrence, Spartanburg, Cherokee, Union.
What became those, but they weren't that then.
And they were called the 96th District.
Because
the most prosperous town in this ceded area was the community of 96, which was on the Cherokee Path to Kiowee, which was the Cherokee lower town capital.
Between Charleston between Fort Granby.
Well,
and there, right?
Exactly.
So why was it called 96?
Well, several different versions of that story, but it was first noted in a map in 1730 by George Hunter, who was hired to survey the Cherokee Path. And he made a notation on his survey that just says 96. And the thought was that he had measured the gait of his horse.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
From that hamlet up to the Cherokee capital. And he came up with 96 miles. Now, I've measured that distance, and it's 73 miles.
Well, the horse could have been short-legged.
He could have been. We may have to change the name. I don't know. But
well, isn't there, because we also have 10 and 20 Creek. We have creeks with the names that I suppose was named for him measuring the gate.
That's exactly right.
Gotcha.
Right. 1 Mile Creek. I mean,
right.
All the way through.
So it was from Kiowee to Fort Granby, which is now where West Columbia is.
That's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
So the Cherokee Path was an important commercial byway back then, because the trade with the Cherokees was very profitable. It was profitable for the Cherokees and for the European settlers as well.
Right.
So the Cherokees were trading deer skins and medicinal plants for all the metal objects like pots and pans and hunting knives and trade muskets and blankets and things.
Well,
of that
that's right.
nature.
I mean, as much as we romanticize the Native American warrior and the wisdom that they were able to communicate, they were a Stone Age people.
They were
a Stone Age people. So when the Europeans showed up, there was a mutual sense of, we want the metal pots, the pans, and it made their life a lot better in the beginning of trying to get those trade goods.
On
that part of it.
The horrible thing that did happen, though, was they were so susceptible to European diseases.
Yes.
That 90% of the Native American population perished due to smallpox and other diseases.
Well, and I know the Cherokee, I think the big smallpox epidemic that really wiped out about half the tribe was like 1740, I think, was one of the big things that hit them. The ones further in were less affected by it than the ones closer to the seacoast where they had more interaction.
Right.
But I tell you what I'd love to do, okay, so there's a landscape with this land being seeded, and we'll put up a map to show all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to talk about here the settlement of the Europeans on how that happened. So when I say here, I mean where we live here in Prosperity, which is where I know more about, and what is now Newberry County, but is like southeastern 96th district, the eastern bend of it. My German ancestors came here from between 1748 and 1750s. And they came here because they were there was people that was sent to Europe from Charleston to bring people here to populate the backcountry.
Exactly, yes.
Because Governor Johnson, after the Yamasee War, which was 1715, the Yamasee War, it was probably one of the almost most successful Indian uprisings the country had. They did a lot of damage, and the Charleston really feared for its existence for a while.
Right.
And they created, they said, we need to populate the backcountry. And so they created township systems.
Yes, they did, yes.
And so that's when they started trying to find people to do it. And, of course, they wanted Europeans and they wanted Protestants. And because we had a Hanoverian king, King George,
right,
they brought over Germans. And so this area was really bleed over from the township that is now Lexington called Saxagatha, and the fork of the Broad and Saluda River. Germans went up the wagon road and settled in what became the Dutch Fork, and that's where the Ballantines came from and where my Bedenbaugh ancestors came from.
So what you're describing is the German immigration into this country, 1748, 1755. Now, 1765, here in the Dutch Fork, the British colonial government started what they called a bounty program, whereby folks from Northern Ireland in particular, or England or Scotland, could come over, and every male over the age of 21 would be granted 100 acres. Every married couple would be granted 200 acres. So
that was the 1755 in response to them buying all this property from the Cherokee, right?
No.
Wasn't at the same time? Because our German ancestors settled here before that was even bought.
Yes, this is, you're exactly right. This is after the Treaty of Saluda.
To try to get populations in it.
Because this area was now owned by the British colonial government, and they could give it to immigrants.
Right.
And that's when Colonel William Ballantine came over with his parents and his younger brothers and sisters. And because he was 22 years old, he was given 100 acres. Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. They came from Northern Ireland. 20 years previous to that.
The Ballantines were Scotch-Irish.
They were.
Okay.
Very much so. And all their neighbors were, except for the German neighbors that they had.
Right.
And they intermarried. But so at the age of 2, William Ballantyne's family moved 20 miles across the Irish Sea and settled in Northern Ireland because they were Presbyterian. And the British wanted non-Catholics to be in Northern Ireland because the British had a serious problem with the Catholics at this time. And it was supposed to be an upgrade, moving from the feudal system in Scotland into the feudal system in Northern Ireland, and it was actually worse.
Well, it was. So let's then just real quick go back to these two groups, because these are the two groups that I focus on here because of what happened here in this area. The Germans that settled here, my ancestor, when he left Germany, he was actually a pioneer in Germany because, again, go back 100 years, these folks lived in what is now, it was called the Transvaal region, in what is now Slovenia, southern Austria. Mm-hmm. And because Austria was Catholic, and because of the absolute devastation of the 30 Years' War that ended in 1648, the religious wars, where all the basically the first devastating European war to where southern Germany was depopulated by half to 2/3. It was devastating. So the princes, once the Treaty of Westphalia happened, the princes said, we want more people. My Bedenbaugh ancestors moved from Transvaal into the town where they lived. It was that person's grandson that then said, oh, well, I'll move to America now.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that these folks that went were used to moving. Same thing with the Scotch-Irish.
Yes.
Right? Because when James I set up the plantation to try to rid the British, felt like they had to rid themselves of the Irish problem, which was because they were Catholic, conquered the Ulster region and moved in northern England, southern Scottish lowlanders into there. Now, these people were very special breed of folks. I've always kind of compared them to Sicilians in the sense that they lived in an area where kingdoms fought over their land constantly, and they had to be a type of people that knew how to survive. And they built clan systems, they built relationships, they were very loyal to each other, and they really weren't shy of a fight when they had to have it. And it was those folks that went to Northern Ireland, and then because of the rents going up or any other issues, they then had to leave. And there was 5 major migrations that came here in America.
Right.
And it's fascinating. I read an account of Quakers when they saw the first Scotch-Irish get off the boats in Philadelphia. And they're like, oh, my God, what's happening? Because these Quakers did not think much of the Calvinistic Scotch-Irish.
I can imagine. I can sure.
And the ones that settled here came here in this area in 1770, the last major migration, directly from County Antrim. So there's the stage. Here we got the Germans settled here and the Scotch-Irish just moving in.
Right, right. You know, so when the Revolutionary War started, we really don't know what Colonel Ballantyne was doing for the first 5 years of that, because in understanding and studying the Revolutionary War in South Carolina, it's very important to realize that there were 2 very distinct periods. And the first 5 years of the war was referred to as the American period. And this was America against American, and it was South Carolinian against South Carolinian. It was a civil war. Revolutionary War was a civil war. And first 5 years, that's the American period. When Charleston fell on May the 12th, 1780, that's when the British period began. The British took over the state within 3 months, and it took 14 months of severe fighting to push them out.
Well, let's go back before we dig into that. Let's go back even further to set the stage of what set the tone. So since I'd mentioned the French and Indian War, which was in the late 1750s, late 1750s, because of an impetuous 22-year-old George Washington that got a little ahead of himself and blamed his interpreter. He actually caused a fight with a French contingent up in, because he was sent by the colonial government to go to western Pennsylvania, because the issue with the English was where the French were and where they were, and the French was settling in areas that the English claimed. And Washington, I think he would have said he made a mistake, but he thought he was doing the right thing, because the people he killed actually was carrying documents to communicate to the government. They were supposed to have safe passage. That ignited what was probably one of the first major colonial world wars. Because it was
definitely a world war.
It was. And it brought in all the European colonial powers. France, England, and Spain came in. Prussia even stepped in, fighting Austria.
It started in England, in Europe, and then moved to America based on what George Washington did and other things. But,
gotcha.
But with the French and Indian War, particularly here in South Carolina, so you have the Treaty of Salute in 1755, which opens up the 96th District. Now, when that became the frontier of America, the 96th District was the frontier of America from 1755 to 1777. The best people in the world moved in here, wonderful folks. And
looking for building a new home.
Totally optimistic. But the worst people in the world also came in.
Well, it's like the old Westerns we used to see on
exactly
TV in the
what it
50s,
It
you know?
was. And then you have a very weak colonial government in Charleston who is not properly giving security and protection to those backcountry settlers. So as a result of that, the regulator movement began. And
okay. So real quick, because it's so much, let's start before that to give the sense that of what people had to deal with. Imagine being up here. How long would it take to get to Charleston from here then?
Oh, that was a 2-week journey to go down and make a complaint.
A dangerous journey.
Yeah.
So if you went up and got your plat, you had to go all the way 2 weeks traveling to Charleston
Yes.
to record your plat.
Yes.
Now, Charleston and the council, what was it called? The settlement council, the city council, the council in Charleston that received people to get their petitions they wanted land. We have a great story, and this feeds into the German aspect of what happened later. We have a great story of a settler named Peter Hare. And Peter Hare came before the council and stated how they were wronged by their sea captain. Peter Hare's father died, and so because he was kind of a leader of the Germans, Palatines that were on the boat, he came to speak to council to say, we were wronged and we were charged, and I had wealth and now I don't because they took my money.
Yeah.
And the council pretty much said, we're giving you free land, we're giving you tools. They gave them tools and kits and everything.
Right.
So don't worry. Just quit complaining. You're getting everything you want.
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of helped set the tone for how people felt up here, because they
right.
were totally, the society of Charleston was like another world.
Yes, it was.
To the folks living up here.
Yes. There were 2 distinct groups in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. There was the coastal elites, who were the plantation owners, the Rice Kings. Massive plantations.
Massive wealth.
Yeah, massive wealth. Charleston was the richest city in America.
Right.
But, the backcountry settlers back here just wanted to have their own lives to themselves with peace and security.
And they didn't have it.
No, they didn't.
Especially after the war was over, so much devastation from the Cherokee and what had to happen there.
Yeah.
When peace came, it was pretty lawless, wasn't it?
It was, and that was where the regulator movement came into play.
So they banded together and basically created their own self-entitled militias called regulators.
Well, but they had militias all along. They were dictated by the colonial government. Every male between the age of 16 and 45 had to go to a monthly militia meeting. But, the regulators were definitely tied in with these militias. And it was a vigilante movement. Now, if they thought somebody was a horse stealer, they would, tie him to a tree and whip him the number of times they thought was appropriate. Wife beaters.
It became somewhat, I mean, it had a good notion at first, but it became somewhat of a reactionary thing where they kind of put law in their own hands and just made examples.
Well, it got totally out of hand.
It did.
And it got so far out of hand that a group arose in opposition, which was called the moderators.
That's right.
So you had the regulators and the moderators.
And the moderators are kind of looked at themselves of, we need a rule of law, and these people are becoming lawless.
Right.
And they almost had a pitched battle with themselves,
yes,
didn't
they did. Yes, they did.
And when did that happen? What was that?
That would have been in 1768. Richard Richardson came up from Camden. He was the militia leader at that time, and
appointed by the colonial government. Or?
Yes, yeah. He was. He was with the colonial mission. He was sanctioned by the British colonial government in Charleston, and through the force of his will, he got those 2 opposing parties to settle down. Now, the regulators' movement was very effective because, as a result of that, the British colonial government did create the 96th district. They paid Leroy Hammond £10,000 to build a 3-story tall brick courthouse and brick jail in the community of 96.
So 96, when it was formed, was really a trading crossroads where they had trade and stuff. It was. And then that's when, since that was the main settle point in the middle of the 96th district,
It wasn't in the middle, but anyway.
Down on the lower part it was.
Right,
So, but you're right. There's all the north didn't have it.
And you know, as settled as 96 was, there were 12 houses.
Wow.
Yeah. And
Did it have a palisade originally before?
It definitely did during the Revolutionary War, and it probably did.
It probably did because the Cherokees attacked it during the French and Indian War.
Yes, they did.
They did.
Well, they attacked Gowdy's trading post, which wasn't exactly in the area of 96, and that was before 12 houses were built.
Wow.
So it was just a crossroads.
So this also sets the tone. You know, when we go to these battlefields and we see all this cultivated bark, we have to really remember this was wilderness, with people living in little ramshackle log cabins trying to cut the ground, kill the trees, open up ground.
Right.
I mean, you have to imagine a landscape of old stumps where they would and dead trees, because they would try to kill the trees and plow around dead trees.
That's it, exactly.
It was a very poverty-rich type of area, yet these people had very high standards of themselves.
They certainly did. One thing that's just really struck me while I've been studying this issue is just how primitive life was back then. Now, they didn't know it, and they were happy. But crude log cabins with dirt floors. Yeah. That's what they lived in. I told you about the 3-story tall brick jail at 96. It was such an incredible feature. It was the first brick structure in the backcountry. Tourists would come from miles away just to stand there and awe and look at the building.
My goodness.
Yeah, I mean, it was
primitive. Amazing.
It was just incredibly primitive.
So that was the way the colonial government tried to deal with the fighting and the frontier battles that were happening, conflicts that were happening, to give people a way to have a court system up here, and also where they record plats and things like that at 96 too.
Yes.
And okay, good.
So it was, in effect, to establish some order and to provide the number one function of government, which is security.
Right.
Now the issue came to be, who is best able to provide that security, because the colonial government really had failed on that end. What was the best system for settlers in the backcountry to have the security that they needed? Was it to depend on some inherited king who had never set foot in America and who appointed his royal men to, make decisions? Or was it up to the people to determine for themselves?
And it was about what people would be determining that too.
Right. Who would be determining that? Right. It was self-determination is what they were fighting for. This was the difference. And the key to there are many different reasons why some people became loyalist and some became patriot. It's a myriad of reasons.
Well, let me ask you something. Don't mean to interrupt, but let's back up a little bit. And so I want to keep all this in South Carolina, but let's talk just real quick the timeline of what started happening in Boston and all of that, just so we can put that in context of what these people in the backcountry were dealing with.
There is no doubt at all that the Revolutionary War began in Boston.
Right.
It did. And that is where the Bostonians overthrew the yoke of British oppression. The British policy towards Boston was just super oppressive. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
The intolerable acts and all of these things in reaction to the Boston Tea Party and everything.
And that's the way that the British government worked. See, there were 25 colonies in the Western Hemisphere, 25, but the British dealt with each one of them individually. So if they were going to pass stringent laws in Boston, they did those and they applied to Boston. But all the other colonies realized what was happening in Boston. If that happened in Boston, it could happen to them.
So when you say 25, because so many Americans think of the 13 colonies.
Right.
It was really 25.
It was
And
5
the
in
British,
Canada, 5 in Canada, 13 here in the United States, 2 in Florida, East Florida and West Florida, and 5 in the Caribbean. And those 5 Caribbean colonies were way more important to the British than what was happening in the United States.
Yeah, because of sugarcane.
Well, and the Spice Islands, they were not going to lose those no matter what. And with their strong Navy, there was hardly any way they could.
Well, and another little flashback is Charleston was settled by folks from Barbados.
Yes.
Barbados was so filled by 1670 that these folks left Barbados and came here, and Charleston, unlike Philadelphia and New York, was really more Caribbean than it was like the other towns.
Charlestown was a colony of Barbados.
Yeah.
It was a colony of a colony.
Not a governmental connection, but social connection. These because Barbados didn't run the place, but it was they left Barbados and came here. So what are Barbadian?
Barbadian. But anyway.
But they were, those first settlers.
Charlestown was created to grow vegetables for Barbados.
Oh, and also meat too,
Well,
right?
Yes, because see, Barbados is a very small island. Plus, it's the easternmost island of the Caribbean. It's off the coast of Venezuela. It's 1,500 miles from Charleston. But the other thing, it's so small. South Carolina counties are basically about the same size. Barbados is 1/4 the size of Newberry County.
And how many people lived there?
It was about maybe 10 or 15,000, but every square inch of Barbados was in sugarcane. They didn't have enough room for growing vegetables.
Because it was a monopolistic thing of sugarcane to send to Europe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's right. So in that way, it kind of was a colony, so resources could feed the main thing that's bringing money into England.
In Barbados, right. And then they started realizing how important the tidal rivers were as far as growing rice is concerned, even though indigo was the first export. But rice soon followed behind, and that was a very profitable business, especially when you had 400 slaves.
That's right. So you had then this type of income that was going here, and that's why Charleston was so wealthy and why it was such a contrast to our ancestors living up here in little tiny hovels of cabins.
There's no doubt. There's 2 different groups. And when the Revolutionary War came, the coastal elites, their primary goal was free trade. And free trade is a noble cause. There's no doubt about that. In the backcountry, the primary motivating factor was self-determination. And determining the policies towards the Cherokees was the crucial factor there. And a big reason that some folks became patriots or versus loyalists in the backcountry was who they thought had the better approach to, the Cherokee situation. Because one thing we didn't talk about when we were talking about the French and Indian War was the first Cherokee War, the Anglo-Cherokee War in 1758 to 1761, which was the Cherokees started out as British allies. And the Cherokees actually were the first to enter Fort Duquesne in Pittsburgh. If it wasn't for those Frenchmen looking up on the surrounding hill and seeing the Cherokees there, 200 Cherokees led by Richard Paris from what's present-day Greenville. Once they saw that, they jumped in their ships and they abandoned Fort Duquesne and sailed down the Ohio River, never to be seen again. So the Cherokees were their allies. On the way back, there were incidents with stolen horses and people getting killed.
Settlers just stealing horses, or the Cherokee taking horses?
The Cherokees, there's a couple of different stories, felt like they were either promised 30 horses by the governor of Virginia or they had 30 horses stolen. Now, when the Cherokees realized that the horses were stolen, they went to the settlers in Virginia and said, who stole our horses, what clan did those men belong to who stole our horses? Because Cherokee tribal law says it's clan versus clan for any disagreements. And the settlers in Virginia were like, clan? We ain't got no clans. We're all one clan. So to a Cherokee mind, and this is the clash of cultures, if that clan stole 30 horses, then you had every right to take 30 horses from that clan. And when the Cherokees were in North Carolina, that's what they did. And the North Carolinians did not care for horse thieves at all. There were shootings that occurred. 30 North Carolinians were killed. The Cherokees come back home. The governors of North Carolina and South Carolina embargo the Cherokees and say, you cannot have any of our goods, no more blankets, no more shot and powder, until you turn over 30 of your warriors for retribution, and we are going to hang them. It was a demand for blood. And so... and
to the Cherokee sense of governance, that was a total betrayal.
Right. Cherokees came down under a white flag. They knew what a white flag was.
And they came down to
negotiate with the governor.
In Charleston.
Yes.
They came all the way to Charleston.
About 25 of their leading men. They didn't have chiefs. They had leading men.
Right.
25 of their leading men came up and said, what can we do? What can we do? And the governor says, there's nothing you can do. You've got to produce those 30 warriors. And then the Cherokee said, okay, well, let us go back and we'll talk about it and we'll let you know. And the governor says, okay, that's fine, but you've got to realize this. The people here in the colony of South Carolina really upset with you and what you did. I'm going to send you an escort of some of my militia to take you back to Kiowee, and they're going to protect you. Well,
as a way to guard them.
As a way to guard them. But once they got to Orangeburg, the escort arrested all those Cherokee leading men, tied their hands behind their back, marched them to the colonial fort, which was at Kiowee, Fort Prince George, put those 25 men inside a guard room built for 6. Well, then the Cherokee leading man of Kiowee, after, there was a standoff, he sends a message under a white flag that he wanted to have a parley. And Lieutenant Courtmore walked out of the gates of the fort and approached the chief who was standing on the banks of the Kiowee River. And at that point, warriors arose from the bank, and they shot Lieutenant Courtmore and killed him under a white flag, which they violated. Well, when that happened, all of the hostages that were inside Fort Prince George, they were immediately killed. There was a siege. The Cherokees completely blocked off Fort Prince George, plus Fort Loudon, which was in Tennessee at that time.
Now, this was in
1759.
59, right?
Yeah,
at the height of the French and Indian conflict.
Well, it was winding down everywhere else.
Gotcha.
But it was going strong here in South Carolina. But, the colonials, they sent a relief party under Archibald Montgomery to break the siege at Fort Prince George, which he did. He starts going further up into the mountains, and they got to Echoe Pass in North Carolina, and the Cherokees ambushed him there. Montgomery declares victory and leaves, but that wasn't enough. And they're sending another party under James Grant to chastise the Cherokees. And the 16 Cherokee towns in South Carolina were destroyed at
the lower towns.
The lower towns,
Gotcha.
plus towns in North Carolina and in Virginia. But
now, was Pickens involved in those?
Yes, he was.
Okay,
yes,
so that's an important thing to remember. So
yeah.
Pickens, which was a militia leader from the Lone Cane District, went up and was one of the leaders.
So was Francis Marion.
Francis Marion was too.
Thomas Sumter during this time was doing the same thing in Virginia. He hadn't come down yet. So, and these were all serving under British colonial officers. and that's where they developed their hitting, run, and ambush tactics from this Indian fight. But the relationship with the Cherokees and with the Native Americans, not with the Catawbas almost always settled with the colonists, but...
And so real quick, the Catawbas were a Siouan-speaking tribe in the northern part of South Carolina,
right,
in the Midlands area, Piedmont area. Cherokee were in the Appalachian Mountain area to the west.
Right.
And they really did not...
They did not get along at all. The
Right.
Cherokees were Iroquois-based, the Catawbas were Sioux-based, and then the Creeks and the 20 or so small tribes along the coast of South Carolina, they were Muskogean.
Yeah.
So we had, and the Cherokees didn't get along with them either. But anyway, there was a 150-year period with the relationship with the Native Americans and the Europeans, and it was a relationship of retaliation and retribution. You know, who started it, when did it end? You know, the Cherokees could kill somebody in Tennessee, and South Carolina would wipe out the lower town, and vice versa.
It was just an overgeneralization of ethnicity, and while at the same time still trying to maintain some sense of trade, because there was a lot of money to be made by the Indian trade in Charleston, and they were constantly trying to figure out how to make it work.
There were great folks on both sides, but there were bad actors on both sides, and there was no control over those bad actors. And the Cherokees were an absolutely free people. The reason they didn't have chiefs is because if somebody made a decision and wanted to go on the warpath, for instance, you could or could not follow him. It did not matter. You had total control over your own life. They were the ultimate in a free society to a fault.
Wow.
You know, and you fought them in battle. They had no battlefield cohesion. All you had to do was charge the Cherokees, and they retreated.
Right.
If each man for himself. That's how they fought in their battles.
Which made it so difficult when treaties were made. Whatever.
You couldn't. You know, treaties were made in South Carolina that had no effect in Ohio, but caused wars in Ohio, and vice versa.
So that era of battle, it helped create a military elite that ended up being involved in the revolution and involved in the regulator movement and in the revolution, right? They were kind of created then, weren't they?
Militias were always around. I mean, even from the Embassy War.
Well, yeah, I don't mean that the militias governmentally were created, but the formation of the leading men's character who were able to step up and say, I'm a leader of the community, like Pickens was,
right,
because of his working and fighting the Cherokee, and they became leadership.
And the leader, the cream rose to the top. You know, these militia meetings they could be at a meeting ground, an open muster field, but most frequently they were at an individual's home, a wealthy man who had plenty of open land, so they could practice horse riding and shooting and all that sort of thing. And they elected their leaders as well. They were probably referred to as captains at this point, captains of companies of 50 men or so.
Right.
But these individuals were elected, and many times they were elected on the basis of who had the best rum or whiskey or beer or anything else, because there was a lot of celebration that went on during these militia gatherings, I'm sure, as well. But I'll talk about the role of alcohol in the Revolutionary War sometime.
Yeah.
That's an interesting subject.
Well, it was a big role in the frontier just because that's how they could commoditize their stuff,
Exactly.
turn it into liquid and sell it.
Yeah.
So we're now in 1775. All the stuff was going on up in Boston and Washington through really brilliance of Knox coming in and kicking the British out of Boston. But then the British tried to come down and take Charleston.
Right.
And was that the same fleet? They just left Boston and then came down?
No.
How did that work?
Well, they left Boston and went to Newfoundland.
Okay.
And Newfoundland
another
was
colony.
Right. Newfoundland was a staging ground for them. And when they left England in convoy, into the wind blow them off, sometimes there'd be 2 and 3 weeks delay before the whole convoy or armada got to where they were going. But they would go to Newfoundland. That was their staging area. And then they would go to wherever they wanted to. So from Boston, those ships went to Newfoundland. And then from Newfoundland, Clinton and Cornwallis came down to take Charleston.
Well, no, I'm talking about 1775 when Howe. But didn't Howe come down first? Because I'm thinking about the Palmetto Fort on Sullivan. Because they tried to come down, and they were going to take Charleston. And this is when everybody sees South Carolina and they see we have used the palmetto. We have 2 symbols on our state flag: the palmetto tree and the crescent.
Right.
So the palmetto tree came from the fact that the haphazard way they had to build a quick fort on what is Sullivan's Island, which was kind of the entrance into Charleston Harbor. Mm-hmm. They built this embankment of palmetto logs, and it basically couldn't be. It absorbed everything.
Right.
And
the logs were constructed. They had an outer wall of palmetto logs, and then they had 16 feet of sand and an inner wall of palmetto.
So
logs.
the logs were just to hold the sand together.
Yeah, but they also, they didn't splinter and, they did absorb those cannonball shots.
And so the saving and the British were not able to take Charleston, they had to run away.
Right.
During that time is when we had a lot of loyalists and fighting going on in the upcountry.
Yes.
And at that time.
Right.
And it quelled. So tell us about that first phase.
In
1775 and
right.
then how it ended.
Well, when the fighting started, again, this was over who could best ally with the Cherokees, because they were 16,000 strong with 6,000 gunmen. So the Cherokees were.
Wow, that was a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. It is. It's the Cherokees from South Carolina up into Tennessee, present-day Tennessee. But I told you that the colonial government bought the 96th district from the Cherokees.
Right.
And the sale price was, and this is not written down, but a convention arose that every fall the colonial government would send a shipment of shot and powder to the Cherokees so they could have their winter hunt, provide the food for the Cherokees, deer skins for the trade in Charleston, 50,000 deer skins a year. So the Committee of Safety, which was the governing body for the Patriots in Charleston at that time, they decided that it would be a good idea if they continued that shipment of shot and powder to the Cherokees to placate the Cherokees. And so that's what they did. So it wasn't the colonial government sending this. Now it's the Patriot government. Well, there was a loyalist leader in the backcountry of South Carolina named Patrick Cunningham. He was the wealthiest man in the Little River District, which is now present-day Lawrence County. He had a group of 200 men. He was going down to Charleston. He was going to rescue his brother, Robert, who was later the loyalist general. This is from the backcountry of South Carolina. This is from 30, 40 miles from where we are right now. The loyalist leaders were from the backcountry of South Carolina.
Right.
Patrick Cunningham, he realizes he's not going to free his brother in Charleston, but he does capture that shot and powder that was being sent to the Cherokees, and he took that to 96, and he's kind of hanging out. He's camped there. Well, the leader of the backcountry Patriot militia is Andrew Williamson, who has a plantation in Greenwood. He raises a force of 450 men to come confront Patrick Cunningham.
And they were neighbors, weren't they?
They were all these people knew each other. This is the Civil War aspect. While Williamson's got 450 men, this is just within a few weeks' time. He's confronting Cunningham's 200 men. Now the Loyalists in the backcountry raise an army of 1,900 men. And these men come, and now Andrew Williamson, with his 450 patriots, they're surrounded by 1,900 Loyalists. Well, the Council of Safety is not going to put up with that. And Richard Richardson, who resolved the regulator-moderator war, he gets up 3,500 South Carolinians and about 750 North Carolinians, and they come, and now they're approaching the siege, 2-day siege that had happened in 96. And
this was in 96 where this was
this
taking
is in
place.
96.
In 1775?
Yes, this is November 19th through 21, 1775. So the Loyalists, they know that they got a big army of 4,500 men coming at them. They decide they want to have a truce. Andrew Williamson, who was besieged, did not know that he had help on the way. So they make an agreement that the Patriots would tear down the fort that they had built, and the Loyalists would go on the other side of the Saluda River. That was their agreement.
Other side meaning south Saluda?
North. It would have been the north,
okay.
yeah. And and then the lawyer's like, okay, all right, well, everybody, we're going home. We're just going to be peaceful and everything. And a few people went up to Richard Richardson and say, oh, we made our truce and everything. You can turn around and go home now. And Richard Richardson said, I didn't make that truce. You know, it doesn't apply to me at all. So he started arresting the Loyalist leaders. And Patrick Cunningham, who started all of this, has still got the shot and the powder. He escapes, and he goes to the wildest, most remote place he can think of, and that's in southern Greenville County in the middle of this big cane break. And
so real quick, a cane
yes.
break at the time in the pristine lands that we had in South Carolina, the flood basins of the rivers and creeks
yes.
were filled with a native bamboo cane.
Right, river cane.
River
yeah,
cane
yeah,
that was there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we don't have any river cane today because every place that river cane grew, corn would thrive. And so early settlers would, plow that under and burn it down and stuff like that. So when Richard Richardson finds out that there's Cunningham encamped in the cane break, he sends a flying column under Major Danger Thompson with 1,300 men to surround that Loyalist camp. 130 of those men get captured, 4 or 5 get killed, 70 get away. This is the Snow Campaign.
Because?
As soon as that battle ended and the Loyalists had their hands tied behind their back, it started snowing. And it started snowing like we have never seen snow since, seriously and literally. That snow was 18 inches deep. It was up to their knees.
And when was this? January?
This is December 22nd, 1775.
Wow.
The Snow Campaign. And those men were marched with their hands behind their back. Many of them didn't have shoes, bloody footprints in the snow. They were marched 2 weeks down to Charleston, where they were put in jail. And in April of 1776, they signed parole saying they wouldn't fight again under pain of death. And some of those men did fight again and were hung.
Later, the second part. But so after that, things kind of settled down here while everything was going on up with Washington and everything up there.
You're exactly right. Things settled down between the Patriots and the Loyalists because the Patriots had totally dominated the Loyalists in the Snow Campaign, and these Loyalists fled to the Cherokee Territory, and they fled down to East and West Florida. Some went up north and joined British forces then. Others just simply went to ground.
They just went home and said, we won't do anything.
I'm a patriot after all. I've changed my mind, which was fine because so many of these people just wanted to be on the winning side.
That's it.
They didn't care,
I remember the movie Shenandoah, the old movie from the 50s. It was about the Civil War where the farmers were just like, we just want to be left alone.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to insert here is our German ancestors here in the Dutch Fork and what happened with them. Because of how they were so neglected, they saw the Anglican low country planter elite treating them like second-hand citizens.
Yes.
German. They all spoke German.
Mm-hmm.
Drayton with was it the Council of Safety? He
Yes.
came up with with an Anglican priest
Yeah.
and the group to come up to basically tell everyone, be part of this revolution. And they met at a place called Spring Hill, which is near what is now Chapin. And in his journal, he writes afterwards, the Dutch are not with us. Because they basically told him, they're like, why should we? For the first time, we've had a king that has given us our own title to land.
Yes.
That king is German, Hanoverian German.
Right.
That king was Lutheran originally, which is what we are.
Yes.
And why should we listen to you Anglican powdered wigs dandies coming up here? And they that's where the initial sense of loyalism came from these very conservative Germans.
That's exactly
which was
right.
a very justifiable reason from their part.
Well,
and logical.
And that's the part with my fourth great grandfather, William Ballantyne. He grew up, dirt poor, terrible life. He comes to America. The king gives him 100 acres, and he can do with it what he wishes. And he was a profitable planter, did well, and he owed that to the King of England. This is a key factor as far as another factor, and I think probably the most important as far as who became a patriot, who became a loyalist, is whether they were first generation or second, third generation.
Yeah, you had said that before. Tell me about that.
Well, when you come over, some folks left England because they hated it. Okay, now they would not have been loyalists, but many of them saw the opportunity that England was giving them, Britain was giving them, and they considered themselves, and they legally were British citizens, even though they couldn't vote the way they wanted to. But they were loyal to their motherland.
And that was, you're talking the first generation.
First generation.
Right.
Now, the second and third generation settlers here were settlers that basically had come down from Pennsylvania and Virginia and North Carolina, because many of the ships came straight into Philadelphia, and then those settlers moved into the Philadelphia backcountry. So England, after the French and Indian War, dictated that this is the Proclamation Line of 1763. It was the Continental Divide, saying, and this is a deal they made with the Native Americans, there will be no settlement beyond the Continental Divide.
Now, this was land they took from France, and so
right,
they were saying, we won this land here, and you can't settle there because we need the trade with the Indians.
Right.
And this is one thing I always love to try to share with folks who keep going back to the policy with the Indians was always genocide. It absolutely was not.
Yeah.
It was, they saw, the government saw the need of income that could come in from Indian trade. Most of the conflict came from the folks on the ground that was a long way from government that had to deal with the misunderstandings of horse stealing.
Right, yeah.
And that's where it really hit, didn't it?
That is where it really hit. It sure is. The Europeans wanted to buy the Native American lands. They were perfectly willing. Now, negotiating a fair sale price, that's a different issue altogether. But selling land to the Native Americans was just an foreign concept. I mean, they did not understand that whatsoever. And if 1,000 Native Americans here decided to sell that land, that doesn't mean that the 10 Native Americans over here had to agree to that.
Right, and that was part of it. That was the cultural issue.
Clash of cultures.
Clash of cultures.
Or if it was, some road rage robber, something like that, who came through and dressed as a Native American. These folks were called Scovillites, after William Scoville. Then you could commit all kinds of depredations, and the Cherokees or whoever would be blamed for it.
Which is why the Tea Party, they dressed like Indians.
Yes, yeah.
They dressed like
Indians.
to try to put the blame on them.
I mean, and this was a tried and true practice for, years. But
wow,
when something like that happened in the backcountry, the Cherokees got blamed. Shawnees sent a raiding party into the backcountry of South Carolina and stole 30 horses. Well, the Cherokees are the ones got blamed for that.
Wow.
So
here we are, 1775. Things had kind of calmed down. The war's going on up in the Northeast in Virginia and New York. What was it then that started happening with the war being introduced back into South Carolina?
Right. Well, the British at that time did have a Southern strategy in mind. And they had created an armada with 9 British warships with 3,000 troops commanded by Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis. And they came down on June 28th, 1776. This is right before the Declaration of Independence is signed. And
so they came down the same time Howe was bringing in his armada of 120 ships into Staten Island and New
Carolina.
York. And New York.
Right,
because
right.
Because Washington was there. And so this is basically the British going, okay, here we go. We got kicked out of Boston, and we're going to come down and really show you people what we can do.
Yes.
And I can't emphasize enough the horror. I mean, you can imagine Washington and all of them sitting there on the shore and seeing what was probably the largest armada ever assembled by the most powerful nation in the world coming up over the horizon. We get excited when we see 10 schooners come into Charleston. Look at the big ships. Imagine 150 of those with, I wrote it down, 235 guns. And they sit there and said, oh, this is now serious. 2 days after that happened, Declaration of Independence was signed.
That was a bold move.
Yes, it was. That says so much about the mentality of how all the slippery slopes of anger toward each other had happened. For that huge armada to come in, and they declared independence 2 days after it. Amazing.
I don't think they knew that armada was there.
No, they were in Philadelphia. They didn't know.
Right.
And Washington, though, was very happy to hear it happen because he's like, now people have to commit.
Right.
We can't, now we're in it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we lose, we're all hang. They didn't do drawn and quartering anymore, but they would have hung. Every one of them.
They certainly would have.
Yeah. So how then Cornwallis and Clinton, who was now in charge of the land battle, Clinton.
Right.
Okay.
So, the British troops landed on Isle of Palms, which is called Long Island at that time. We had the Palmetto Log Fort on Sullivan's Island, which is next to Isle of Palms. But separating the two islands is Breach Inlet. Mm-hmm. And everybody in South Carolina knows that Breach Inlet's a very dangerous place with strong riptides and it's 7 feet deep. But the British had intelligence that told them that at low tide, Breach Inlet was 18 inches deep and they could walk right across. Well, that turned out not to be the case. So the troops were stymied on the Isle of Palms. But we still had that armada that was getting ready to let loose with their cannons on the Palmetto Log Fort. And Francis Marion was at Fort Moultrie, is what it was called at that time.
Was it called Fort Moultrie before the war or after because of Moultrie's? I think it was after, right?
Well, Moultrie built it.
Moultrie built it.
Yeah,
okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and it. But anyway. And he's the one that designed the flag that was flying there as well.
So I want to do a little aside here because of that crescent. Okay. So I want to hear your thoughts on this. I did a lot. So anybody who knows South Carolina, we have the Palmetto and we have a crescent on the upper left side. I had always thought You know, when you see old pictures of the older paintings of that time period, people wore a gorget. And I always thought, you know, that must have been a gorget because the original flag had liberty. So what better way to put liberty on a shield, which gorget was a symbolic shield? Mm-hmm. Well, I found out that was absolutely not true.
Absolutely.
Absolutely not true. And this is where it really gets interesting. Governor Bull, who was the lieutenant colonial governor in South Carolina during the French and Indian War, Moultrie was one of the militia captains. Mm-hmm. Governor Bull's hallmark for his it was, what's it called, where you have symbolism of the nobility symbolism. He was the second
heraldic mark.
Yes, heraldic mark, and his heraldic mark in the Bull family was a crescent. So the militia under his governance, they wore a crescent. Mm-hmm. So now, 15 years later, Moultrie wants to put on a flag. The governor is now the same Bull that he used to fight under. He writes liberty on the crescent, mm-hmm. and I know that was a poke in the eye of Governor Bull.
Well, I didn't know that. I hadn't quite heard that story.
Well, I'm assuming the issue of why he did it on there, why he used it, it just makes sense that he would take the herald mark of the governor and put it on there. But that's where it came from, inspired by that old militia symbol they used 15 years before.
I have heard, there are so many stories, you know, and I can give you counter stories to almost every single event that you could come up with. I mean, yep. Just the way these are written. So let me tell you what I've heard.
Okay. Yeah, please.
So Moultrie himself described exactly what symbols are on the flag. Mm-hmm. And he said that it is a blue flag with a crescent. He doesn't say crescent moon.
Right.
He damn sure doesn't say gorget.
Right.
That, I don't know any reference before 1980 that refers to gorget as being the symbol on the map.
Yeah, and that's some of the stuff I had read years ago, right. And it stuck with me.
But I've also heard, now I know this, in 1765, when the Stamp Act was passed, that's when you started seeing folks in Charleston wearing Liberty caps. Mm-hmm. And I think they were referred to as Pharyngean caps or something like that. They were the silliest looking things you've ever seen. They were yellow, and they had a silver crescent on them. And this was the Liberty caps. So that's one explanation that I've heard. I've also heard that William Moultrie could trace his family all the way back to the Norman Conquest and the Crusades.
Moultrie sounds potentially French. The Norman, it's an Anglo-Norman name,
right,
isn't it?
Right. I can see the Moultries being crusaders.
Yeah.
But that, because of that, on the Moultrie family crest, the heraldic mark was a crescent.
Oh, it was?
The Islamic crescent. This is what I've heard. But now I've looked up the Moultrie crest, and there's no crescent on there. But it's
this
part of the story that you're talking about as part of the heraldic marks, and it would have been the Islamic crescent.
Well, I sat down with Eric Emerson, and we dug through, and he communicated. We were on the phone, and he sent me stuff, and he convinced me that was it definitely wasn't a gorget, and it was rooted in belief of Lieutenant Governor Bull and then Governor Bull. So there's that. So that comes why we have these two symbols. And South Carolina was unique among all the colonies that had such powerful symbolism rooted in this revolutionary formation.
We have the most beautiful flag in the country.
Yeah.
There is no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Indigo blue. Indigo was our first export. Mm-hmm. So we're proud of that flag.
And so everybody outside of South Carolina, give us some pride for ourselves. That's all. So that was I mentioned it earlier. I thought that was 1775, but it was 1776. It was parallel with the invasion of New York. Mm-hmm. So Charleston beat off what New York couldn't.
Well, we didn't have quite the incredible armada in Charleston that was in New York. But, the defenders of Fort Moultrie, with their 31 guns, blasted the hell out of Sir Peter Parker and his 361 guns. They anchored in the harbor there and started blasting away. But what they received was much greater than what they gave.
Wow.
The governor, William Campbell, the British governor, who was in exile, was standing on deck with Admiral Peter Parker when a shot came from Fort Moultrie and blew up in between them. William Campbell eventually died from the wounds he received that day, and Sir Peter Parker wound up with a 3-foot-long splinter that hit him right in the rear end.
Ouch.
So, yeah. So that was...
I'll tell you, there was nothing more brutal and horrible than warfare on those wooden ships.
No kidding. I can imagine. But during this time, what was the coincidence, if you will, is that at the same time that the British were attacking Charleston, the Cherokees were on the warpath. Now,
which is what you were mentioning before of what was going on.
Well, this is much more serious than what was going on before. Much more serious. Now, the question is, did the British foment this uprising to undertake a two-front campaign in South Carolina with the Navy on the coast and the Cherokees in the backcountry with divided South Carolina resources? And the Patriot leaders felt for sure that John Stewart, the Indian agent, and his assistant, Alexander Cameron, were fomenting that uprising. Now, there's some evidence that they actually counseled against the Cherokees going on the warpath because they knew what was going to happen.
But it's, again, who they talked to versus others, right? It just wasn't a great, strong chain of command.
It wasn't.
Point is, Cherokee rose up.
And the Shawnees came down, and they definitely counseled the Cherokees that everybody was going to go on the warpath at the same time. So there were 61 settlers killed along the Cherokee territory. And the Cherokee territory at this time was Greenville, Anderson, Pickens, and Oconee counties. There were 16 lower town Cherokee towns, with the capital being at Keowee. The closest town to the border was Seneca, which is basically at the Clemson campus. It's underwater now. And that was a staging ground for raids into the backcountry. And the other spot was Richard Parris's plantation at the falls of the Reedy River, which is in downtown Greenville right now. So,
so was Fort Prince George gone then? Was that still? It was gone because of what happened 15 years before. So it was just the Cherokee.
Yeah, it was just the Cherokees, and right. So, again, and these 61 settlers were killed in a very gruesome fashion.
That's one thing that modern day folks have a hard time kind of absorbing. There was a ritualistic method of how Native Americans would kill their enemies.
Yes.
Because they saw the enemies not as flesh and blood as much as their soul, their energy, and to put them through horrible torture was a way to kill their soul. Right? Is that a generalization?
Well, I agree with that. But what I've sort of come to the conclusion was the Cherokees did not put up no trespassing signs on their borders.
Right.
What gave them security was an overwhelming, overriding sense of fear from their enemies. If you were a Catawba, it was considered that the Broad River was the border between the Catawbas and the Cherokees. If you were a Catawba, there's no way you wanted to go over that Broad River and subject yourself to what could be the most gruesome death possible. It was that fear that the Cherokees engendered. Now, if there's any, Cherokees, communal life, total freedom, sometimes you'd have to admire the way they live, not others. But one trait that the Cherokees had, which I have disagreement with, and to the European mind, we can't accept this. They did not believe in the power of mercy. If you showed mercy towards your enemy, that was a weakness that you had. Mm-hmm. So they avoided mercy. Now, the beloved woman of each of the 7 clans, if she thought that this fella who was getting gruesomely tortured to death possibly could make a suitable husband for one of her maidens, she did have the power of life and death.
Now, who is the beloved woman?
Every clan had a senior matriarch, and this was a matriarchal system.
Right. Traders would buy into the Indian community by marrying,
yes,
because hereditary lines went through the women. The clan lines went through the women.
Yes. And this is another way that it's a huge difference between the European mind and the Native American mind. Fathers did not raise their children.
Mothers did.
Mothers did, and the mother's brothers, because they were in the same clan. Now, that doesn't mean that men did not raise children. They raised their sisters' children, and they taught their sisters' children how to hunt in the way of the clan, how to, go about your daily activities that reflected how things were done in that particular one of 7 clans.
So culturally, that's like
it's incredible.
That's like an alien system to Europeans,
right?
Which is another reason why you had such a clash of cultures on how to communicate and everything. But the way the way some of these people died by taking days to burn alive, and it was just really horrible.
It was horrible,
and which is why. When people like Pickens and they went up and burned all the villages, which is what happened.
Yeah.
It's why they showed no mercy, because they felt like no mercy had ever been shown to them and to their people.
You're talking about the Cherokees showing no mercy, or Pickens? Pickens didn't show mercy either.
No, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the backcountry settlers, and the Scotch-Irish especially, who had lived a life of warfare and clannish relationships, just would go and wipe out villages.
Well, see, that's what happened. The first Cherokee War basically lasted 3 years. The second Cherokee War lasted 3 months, because at this point the settlers had realized what it's going to take to quell the Cherokee depredations.
Right.
And what it was going to take was total annihilation, and that's what happened. They totally destroyed those 16 Cherokee towns. They trampled all the crops down. They chopped down all the orchards. They shot all the cows and pigs on sight. They shot the men, women, and children on sight. There was 2,000 Cherokees killed in the Cherokee War of 1776.
In South Carolina, or just all over the whole lower towns?
Well, that's the 16 lower towns. There were about 15 or so middle towns in North Carolina, and those were destroyed by the North Carolina militia. And there was just one Overhill town, which was destroyed by the Virginia militia. The Georgia militia under Captain Jack was also destroying Cherokee towns as well. The Cherokees from the lower towns were driven into the mountains for the winter with only the clothes on their backs. The Treaty of DeWitt's Corner was signed in 1777, and at that point, all but a small strip in Oconee County was ceded, and this became the new ceded lands to the colonial government at that time. Not the colonial government, the continental government.
Right, and I'm going to put a map up to show the what became the 96th district, which was the Treaty of Saluda, and then the part that was theirs, and then how it went up again.
Yeah.
Because, again, you can't understand the revolution here without the passions that came about from the Indian warfare that happened on the frontier.
Right. And it's my contention I mean, like I say, there are numerous reasons why some became patriots and some were loyalists. The other thing is there were lots of loyalists who fought in this campaign. There were loyalists. There were lots of people who switched sides throughout the entire war. When you got captured, you had the option of fighting with your enemy and not going to a prison camp or a prison ship, which was
horrible.
Worst. That was horrible.
These were prison ships that were in the harbor of Charleston,
yeah.
Where prisoners were kept, and many of them didn't survive.
Right,
They were
terribly disease infested.
Yeah.
That was Britain's greatest tragedy,
on how they
is what
handled
they
that.
did was with the prison ships.
So let's jump back to the timeline of all of a sudden everything going on up. Saratoga happened by supposedly by Gates. We can get into that, but the British now say, let's look. They believe there's a lot of loyalists in South Carolina. They've ignored it. So South Carolina was sitting in peace for what, 4 years?
Exactly, due to
4 years.
The Snow Campaign and the Cherokee War of 1776. There was hardly any loyalist activity. They had basically all gone down to Florida, and Florida was a thorn in our side. We sent 3 expeditions, 76, 77, and 78, to try to get a handle on what was happening down there. They were all unsuccessful.
So that's why Florida wasn't part of the colonies to rebel against it, because they were filled with loyalists that came from up here, in a way, right?
Right. Florida changed hands 4 times in 60 years. Nobody wanted Florida until air conditioning was invented. It was just, But anyway, so, 1778, things were so quiet around here that Thomas Sumter retired. He got bored and he went back to his store.
Thomas Sumter had moved down here by then, right?
Yes.
He was from Virginia. He came to South Carolina.
He escaped from jail in Virginia and came to South Carolina.
Yeah, I enjoy putting a few dents in Sumter's armor, and Francis Marion would do the same thing, but we'll get to that later.
Actually, he was in jail for a relatively noble cause. But anyway, there's that.
What was the cause? What was he in jail for? In Virginia?
He carried a delegation of Cherokees over to London at the end of the French and Indian War. And whereas the first delegation that went over in 1730 was just the hit of the town. Everybody loved these 8 Cherokees. I mean, that was something else.
Oh, they
met
dressed
with the
exotically
king and everything.
Yeah.
No, they weren't dressed exotically. That's the way the British painted them, though. But anyway, so Thomas Sumter decides that he's going to take 3 Cherokees over with Henry Timberlake, and he talks to the governor, and the governor's like, yeah. So they go over there, and it's disappointing. It wasn't anything like the first visit. This is like 1763 or so. So Thomas Sumter comes back, and he goes up to the governor and he says, okay, well, we had a successful meeting over to London. Here's my receipts. I'm ready to be reimbursed for my cost. And the governor looks at him and says, receipts? Reimburse? What are you talking about? So Sumter had borrowed all this money from creditors up in Virginia, and the governor refused to back him on that trip, where Sumter thought that he had the governor's word that he would. So Sumter wound up in jail for that.
Because of creditors, he couldn't pay the bill.
It was debtor's prison in Stanton, Virginia. And
which is a beautiful town now. Love Stanton, Virginia.
Yeah, it is beautiful.
So we're mentioning Sumter. So folks outside of South Carolina, we look at our backcountry leadership during the war between Sumter, Pickens, and Marion. And so Sumter is one of those. So this is one of the backgrounds of this fellow that came from Virginia and moved down here.
Right. And he was a hell of a fighter. He was charismatic. He was kind of a big fella.
Thought a lot of himself too.
Yeah, he thought a lot of himself. I mean, he absolutely did. Sumter could get 1,000 men in the field, and Sumter had some of the best colonels of all.
Yeah.
And if those colonels appreciated and his leadership ability to the, that's the best thing you can say about Sumter.
So what engaged? So we have. Let's go, because these are the folks that are going to really play a big role when Clinton decides to take Charleston. And so they decide to do that.
In May of 1780.
May of 1780.
Right. Well, when Charleston fell, Benjamin Lincoln surrendered 5,000 men. 2,500 of those men were Continental soldiers. These were regular, trained American soldiers, materials provided by the French. They had on the blue uniforms.
So Washington had sent Lincoln down to run the Southern Army.
Right.
And he basically allowed it to get captured, or didn't allow, but he just got beat and he got it.
Yeah.
And it was the largest surrender.
It was the biggest defeat in the American Revolution.
Was 5,000 men getting captured inside Charleston.
Right. But 2,500 of them were Continentals, and those Continental soldiers, those men wound up on prison ships in Charleston Harbor.
Wow.
2,500 of those men were militiamen. Henry Durant was one of those.
Volunteer folks that grabbed their gun off their cabin and went to fight for whoever they voted to be their leader.
That's right. Yeah, that's what they did. So on June the 1st, Henry Clinton made a proclamation, and what he proclaimed was, if you're a militiaman and you go home and you lay down your arms and you don't leave your property, you will be treated as a neutral in this war.
Right.
And all of the militiamen took him up on that.
And that was 1780. That was
June the 1st, 1780. So then, he got a lot of guff from that from his fellow officers and so forth. He decided to issue another proclamation on June the 19th. And on June the 19th, what he said was, look, folks, I've kind of changed my mind here. You need to take up arms and join and fight with the British regulars and take up arms against your former comrades. And that just set off an absolute firestorm.
And I've always thought that changing that proclamation is the seeds of the defeat of the British. There.
I agree. I mean,
because if he wouldn't have done that, these folks had all given up, Pickens included.
Well, talking about security and the importance of the Cherokees on who you were allied with in the Revolutionary War. The leaders of the Cherokee War of 1776 and all the way up to the period when Charleston fell, the leaders were Andrew Williamson. He was a general. He was senior to Pickens, Marion, and Sumter. Second in command to Williamson was Andrew Pickens. Next in command to Andrew Pickens was Robert Anderson. John Thomas Sr. was the founder of the Spartan Regiment, and he was the tip of the spear in that Cherokee War of 1776. All of these leaders surrendered to the British control. And what they were they had taken care of the Cherokees. They had driven them into the mountains. There wasn't that much of a problem with them. That was one of their main primary concerns. So all of these people sought British protection, security, and they were willing to quit fighting because they had controlled the most fearsome thing in their life.
Now, after Charleston fell, so when I first asked Durant to come and speak, little did I know we would end up eating up 3 hours of audio tape on talking about the Revolution. But actually, it didn't surprise me. Durant is an amazing storyteller, and he is so knowledgeable And I have such a huge curiosity into the Revolution. So we decided to break it into 2 episodes. That was the end of part 1. I thought a perfectly fitting place because we ended it where the turning point of the Revolutionary War could have been for the British. But as you will see in part 2, the British just couldn't get out of their own way. So, until part 2 airs, place, purpose, preservation. See you next time.